9:32 a.m. Eastern, or half an hour from now, NASA wowed people around the world when it launched its first ever mission to the moon.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Now, success wasn't guaranteed for the 3 astronauts on board. Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and Neil Armstrong, the first human to step foot on the moon's surface. It was 50 years ago they completed that landmark feat. But the accomplishments of those astronauts paved the way for the advanced space exploration we see today.
On behalf of the crew of the International Space Station, we hope you'll join us in celebrating the 50th anniversary of that giant leap for all mankind, as we look towards the next giant leap on our endless journey to the stars.
Canadians have also had their time in space. We'll be looking at their important contributions to Apollo 11 and so many missions since then. Now, let's lead off a special hour of coverage with 2 people who know a lot about space. First off, we have Nicole Mortellero. She's CBC's science reporter, senior science reporter, and joining us now and staying with us this complete hour, a very special guest, and I'm very honored to have him with us. Chris Hadfield is the first Canadian to command a spaceship and the first Canadian to walk in space. Good morning to both of you. I'm so thrilled to have you both. But Commander Hadfield is also an author of An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth, The Darkest Dark. It's a children's book about watching the moon landing on TV and learning how to be brave. So let's start with Commander Hadfield first. He's at his cottage in St. Clair River near Sarnia, Ontario. So thrilled to have you. I think viewers are thrilled to have you. We have a ton of questions, but first off, I think the most obvious question to you, Commander, is when you watched that, you were age 9, and you were at a cottage just down the road from where you are now. Tell viewers what it was like.
Yeah, in fact, good morning, and it's nice to be talking with you, Hannah, and you also, Nicole. It was fantasy becoming reality. I love science fiction. I love reading comic books. I'd been to see the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. I was watching Star Trek on TV. My little boy brain was all full of all that fantastic stuff. And yet, just a few cottages from here, I walked over to a friend's cottage to see that launch 50 years ago this morning and to watch them land on the moon just 50 years ago later this week. And it suddenly turned fantasy into reality. It turned those science fiction ideas into something that people actually do. And it really sort of gave me permission as a little Canadian kid to imagine myself doing something entirely different.
Nicole, I know you have to look back on that, but what did that mean watching that video for you?
Yeah, unfortunately, I was born 3 months before Apollo 17, the last mission in 1972. But for me, I still get teary-eyed. You know, I was watching a doc the other day and just imagining what they were feeling. I mean, the fear, the trepidation, but the determination to go. And I, too, growing up, I was into science fiction, still am. And, you know, this made me, even though we haven't been in 47 years, it made me realize that, yeah, this is a possibility and this could happen again once in my lifetime.
And we have been asking for viewer questions throughout the morning, so I really want to get to them because they're really coming in fast and furious. So let's take our first viewer question. It's to you, Commander Hadfield. It's from Margaret Tarrant Isaacs, and she's on Facebook. She says, would you have loved to have gone to the moon?
Well, Margaret, I still would. I would love the chance to explore further than we have ever had a chance to do it, whether it's living permanently on the moon, which is what we're working towards now, or going even further out. Ever since I was that little boy at this cottage dreaming about it, it's kind of what I tried to become capable of. It's why I became a pilot and an engineer and all those things. And so the opportunity to do that, sure, it still thrills me. And if you're offering, Margaret, I would love to go walk on the moon. Sure, why not?
Any chance you could still go?
It's really just a question of vehicles, right? You know, it's like where are we in history in building rocket ships? And it's getting better and better. We've come a long way since the enormous Saturn V rocket that took Neil and Buzz and Mike to the moon, for the space shuttle, and now with what some of the companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX are building. It drops the cost a lot, so that opens up a lot of opportunity. I don't think I'm going to get a chance to walk in the moon, but
Maybe
boy, if the opportunity comes, I'll go.
Maybe as a traveler, as we were talking to Colonel Hansen earlier, and he says, hey, he would like to command one of these ships, so maybe you could go as a traveler.
Yeah, well, Jeremy has a real opportunity to go to the moon as one of Canada's astronauts, as does Jenny Seide and Josh Kutrick, our three newest astronauts. We're just on the cusp now of transitioning from that early exploration that the Apollo astronauts did to now getting into settlement, transitioning from sort of crazy camping exploration to making it part of the Earth economy. And that's happened many times in history, and you sort of lose track of it. But it really comes down to ships and people's capability. And if Jeremy's got an extra seat in his spaceship, I'm happy to keep it warm.
I love how he's pitching to go to the moon. Now, Nicole, I want to bring you in here just for a second, because you were asked earlier by a viewer, would it be faster to get to the moon today than it would have been back in 1969? You had a fascinating answer to this.
Well, physics is physics. And, you know, the Saturn V still to this day is the most powerful rocket ever launched. SLS will rival that. That will be, instead of 7.5 million pounds of thrust, it'll be 8.4 or 8.8. But there's still a certain speed at which we need to go to be captured by the moon or and travel there. So it won't really make that much of a difference. You're still looking at a couple of days, a few days.
A few days. Again, Commander Hadfield, another question for you. And this one comes from Hector Cotre. And sorry if I pronounced the name wrong. He's on Facebook. And I think you were just answering this, but are any CSA astronauts trained to go to the moon currently?
Well, we all are, to some degree. I mean, the vast bulk of an astronaut's training is in operating rocket ships, commanding spaceships, orbital mechanics, control theory, how all those things work. And whether you launch from Earth into Earth orbit, where you dock with the International Space Station, or if you launch from Earth and as Nicole just said, you fly for 3 days and get somewhere else, a lot of the technical stuff, it's exactly the same. And a lot of work that Jeremy and David Saint-Jacques have been doing is training in Canada's Arctic, looking at lunar-like topography, training what it would be like to live in a really remote area, harsh conditions, much as the Apollo astronauts did in Sudbury back in the 60s, just to try and get a better sense of preparation for what's going to be involved. None of them are ready to go. There's no vehicles taking us right yet, but we're getting close. And it's lovely that Canada is right in the thick of all that we've decided to be part of the exploration of the rest of the universe. I'm really proud of us as a group of people for being right in the forefront of all that.
And I want to come back to that in just a minute. Nicole, you wanted to jump in on this question.
I was going to add to that, as Chris said, that there have been Jeremy and David have been training up north, but there are these great training programs. There's the Caves program, which takes them underground, and it's all training for even potentially going to Mars. So I think that the Canadian Space Agency and NASA and the European Space Agency are very proactive with the potential of going elsewhere.
Sorry, Commander Hadfield, did you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, it's a long training flow. There are so many things you have to know. And the further you get from Earth, the more independent you have to be. What if someone gets appendicitis? Right. What if, as happened to the Apollo 11 crew, partway down to the surface, they have a serious computer problem? Or the landing site that Neil and Buzz eventually touched down on, it was covered in boulders and rocks and it was on the edge of a crater. Even when it came right down to the last minute, they had to take over and land manually. So the amount of preparation and training is huge. All three of those guys that launched 50 years ago this morning were super experienced pilots, jet pilots. They were all combat fighter pilots. They fought in wars. They'd become test pilots. They devoted their whole lives to getting qualified just to be ready for those things. And that's what our astronauts do for a living now. It's what I did for 21 years. And so, yeah, wherever the spaceships are going, Canadians will be ready.
one of the questions is coming in from Danny Lamontagne on Facebook. Danny asks, what were you doing when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and did it encourage you to become an astronaut? You kind of answered that off the top there, that it was a part of the reason why you became an astronaut. But is there this, moment that you think back and go, that's it?
Well, a couple things, Hannah. One, there was no internet, of course, but it was the most watched television event ever up to that point. Hundreds of millions of people around the world were watching simultaneously. It was immensely unifying for the human species to do something so challenging and so new and so exquisitely complex. And I was one of those hundreds of millions of people watching, just a few cottages from here. And so what I was doing exactly was sitting with my back against the wall. My brother Dave was, and it's his birthday today. My brother
Happy
Dave
birthday.
was right beside me. Yeah, and in a room full of people, and it was late at night. The moon was almost full, just a few days before the moon became full, and I just couldn't believe it. It was, grainy black and white television with the bunny ears on top back then, but it was real. This was actually happening. And that to me was the magnificent part, was the link between imagination and possibility. And that changed my whole perception of who I thought I could be. Even though I was a little Canadian kid in a country that didn't have a space agency or astronauts or rockets, it still changed my opinion of who I could be. That's just how influential it was all around the world. And it shaped my choices, which eventually turned me into a spaceship commander. Amazing, the far-reaching economic and technological, but also sociological impacts of us doing something that challenging.
Nicole, we were talking a bit earlier that this has been seen as an American event, but there were a lot of Canadians involved in it and a lot of Canadian content as well.
Yeah, I think we tend to downplay or be a little modest about our contributions, because I know I didn't even know about them until I was much older. Owen Maynard from Sarnia, Ontario, was the primary designer behind the lunar lander. You had James Chamberlain, who was he really was a big proponent of the rendezvous. So getting making it a two-step process. So the lander comes up, gets to the command module. Then the doctor that saw them afterwards, the Apollo 11 astronauts, William Carpentier, he was Canadian. He was Canadian, and even the legs that were, so we talked about the design, but the legs that were on the lander were built by a Canadian company out of Montreal. So we're all over the place. And even later missions, Apollo 16 and 17, Sudbury, was a stand-in because it's a crater and they could find rocks similar to those that were on the moon. And then even in Apollo 13, Canadians were there, people at University of Toronto, helping them do the calculations to get the astronauts safely back home when the mission failed.
Commander Hadfield, we have some more questions from our viewers. This one comes from Darren Stentiford on Facebook, and Darren asks, what are some challenges that are different about a lunar landing compared to boarding ISS?
Darren, a couple big ones. One is, of course, you're much, much further from home. You're 400,000 kilometers away instead of 400 kilometers away. So you're much more isolated, so you need to be more independent. The second is, once you've landed on the moon, you're stuck there. You can't just separate it and gently float back to Earth. You have to fire a rocket to get away from the moon's gravity and then fire another big one to be able to get all the way back to Earth. And so the risk is higher because you're counting on those rocket engines to bring you all the way back home. And then the third big difference is the life on board the space station is very clean and controlled. It's like being in a hospital or something. It's a very pristine environment. The moon is dirty and rugged. It's like landing out in a really rough part of the Earth, of a desert. And the grit of it, each little tiny grain of sand on the moon is more like broken glass because there's never been any water or erosion to smooth them. So walking on the moon is like walking in dusty, broken glass, and that is really hard in all the machinery. So lots of little subtle differences. When you put them together, it makes it a whole different challenge to get to the moon, whether we did it 50 years ago this morning or when we do it next time.
Nicole, you wanted to jump in there?
Well, I was just wondering how you were on the shuttle, and that, I think I was looking up, it's 1.2 million pounds of thrust. Can you even imagine? So that's a big jolt. Can you even imagine 7.5 million pounds of thrust and what that might feel like for you on a human body?
Yeah, the Soyuz is about 1.3 million, I think, and the shuttle was about 4.5 million pounds of thrust. But as you say, the Saturn V was those huge 5 F1 engines. That was about 7.5 or a little more million pounds of thrust. An immense amount of power. I think if you convert it like into horsepower, it's like 80 million horsepower. I mean, it's such a big number you can't even imagine it. But and you are in the middle of that. And I know that Neil and Mike and Buzz's heart rates went up a little bit when that was happening. As John Young said, if you're not excited and worried when this thing's launching, you don't understand what's happening. and this huge amount of power, but you're there as if you're in the jaws of some enormous malevolent dog that is just shaking you, and you can't do anything about that. You can focus on all of the safety procedures and being ready to take action to either abort and land or get to orbit, but you're very much aware that you are in the eye of an incredible hurricane, and you're getting pummeled by the forces, and that there are things going on way bigger than you in order to escape from Mother Earth, try and get to orbit, and that first important complex step to leave and go to the moon.
Were you scared?
I wasn't scared. It's dangerous, the most dangerous. I used to be a fighter pilot intercepting Soviet bombers, and I was a test pilot. Dangerous jobs. But nothing I ever did was more dangerous than my first space shuttle launch, just statistically, if you were my insurance agent. And but I wasn't scared. And it's actually, you mentioned at the outset, Hannah, the book that I wrote for kids, The Darkest Dark. Everybody gets scared. The real question is, how do you deal with danger? And what's the difference between danger and fear? They're not the same. So long as you're good at something, you've learned how to do it, like riding a bike or driving a car or something, even though the danger's still there, you're no longer afraid. And I learned how to fly spaceships. I spent most of my life learning how to do that, so that even though the danger was high, I wasn't just afraid, I was ready. And to me, that's a really important distinction. And it's something I learned 50 years ago this morning, watching those three guys, that there's a difference between danger and fear. Those guys were ready, and that's the person I wanted to be, somebody who was ready for my own decisions in my own life.
And we're showing side by side there some archival footage of that day in 1969 where you see that rocket taking off and the power that must have been behind that. Let me go to some more questions here because they're coming in fast and furious. And I think for both of you, I want to ask you this one. It comes from Jordan Crosby on Facebook. And Jordan asks, what's your opinion on those who insist the moon landing didn't happen? And if you could see Nicole's face right now, but Mr. Hadfield, you're up there. So what are your thoughts on that? Because we do hear these conspiracy theories quite often when people, are discussing the moon landing.
Well, if someone deliberately chooses to be stupid and ignorant, that's their choice. And everyone can make that choice if you want. But it doesn't mean that then you're suddenly credible or you have a reasonable argument. So, I mean, where do they think the Saturn V went that launched out of Florida? I mean, it's ludicrous. It's foolish. There are people that think World War I didn't happen. There are people that think all kinds of silly ideas, just intellectually lazy. And it's way easier to believe something than it is to make the effort to understand it. You can believe something like that, but if you actually want to use your brain and learn about things, that takes more effort. So I just ignore people who are choosing to be deliberately ignorant and stupid. They don't deserve intelligent conversation. So the more you talk about them, the more of a disservice you're doing to everybody else who's actually engaged in life.
And Nicole, you were rolling your eyes, in fact.
You know, there's nothing wrong with skepticism, but
Right.
when you see the evidence presented before you, that's when you have to accept what is set before you. I mean, it's the same thing that Chris said, which is, where did you think that was going? And also, we've seen the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter take pictures of the footsteps from the astronauts. You know, it's unfortunate that people are ignorant that way, and I agree that just don't even give them any.
Okay, no more airtime for them then. I'm coming back to you, Commander Hadfield, and this one comes from Honorary Colonel, 2nd Air Movement Squadron, John Cairns. He says, a quick question for you. What's at stake? Does humanity have in space exploration in terms of unity and peace? That's a pretty interesting question.
It's a good question. Exploration has brought us most of the quality of life that we have. Our ability to explore our world and therefore to research it and understand it, the quality of living that we enjoy, the length of average life, the level of education, they're at an all-time high for the human species. And we're at the point now where we're starting to develop a real global conscience. It's hard, and we're not doing it perfectly, but we're in the process of doing it, and it's necessary. That all comes from exploration and curiosity and pushing the edges of what we don't know. And the International Space Station is a great example of that. 15 countries that are always squabbling about stuff here on this Earth and have their own political cycles and their own economic cycles. And yet, at the same time, when you challenge that same group of people to do something really hard, to start exploring the rest of the universe, they can also find reasons to cooperate and to put away the transient pettiness and realize that there are things that are bigger than the screaming headlines of this week. And that has been happening for 25 years or more on the International Space Station since I first went there in '95. Every day, 24/7, since 2000, we've had crews from 15 nations of the world living off the world, working peaceably as an example, and you can watch it go over on a regular basis, anybody in the world. I think it provides a different example, especially in a time when the news is just yelling bad news at us to try and get our attention every single day. I think it's good to focus on some of the amazing stuff we're doing and where our inventiveness and exploration has taken us, the benefits it's given us, and where we're going next.
And in 1961, it's interesting that the geopolitical situation at that time, when John F. Kennedy put this in motion, it took 8 years, but there was a lot going on then, too.
Oh, yeah. If you had talked to anybody at that time and talked about the International Space Station, that Russia and the United States were going to jointly be behind, at least the big players behind a working space laboratory, I'm sure nobody would have believed you. And yet here we are. And no matter even as we do squabble here at home, it's still, the astronauts say, that's what's happening on Earth, but up at the space station, we do the science and we work together.
I want to take you right now to the Smithsonian in Washington, where they are unveiling Neil Armstrong's spacesuit. So let's watch this together, and I want to get your reaction on it. I'm not sure you can see that, Commander, but it's a much different suit than in your time.
I'm intimately familiar with that suit, as well as the one that is celebrated on the back of our $5 bill, the spacesuit that I wore for my first spacewalks. That one, it was Neil's, and custom built to his size. But if you look at it on the outside, it's still the dirtiest around the feet and gets cleaner and cleaner up towards his head. It still has the grit of the moon in the fabric. And when they did the rebuild of it here recently, in order to preserve that historic garment like a suit of armor from hundreds or thousands of years ago, it was mostly the inside, the rubber and seals and stuff that were degrading. So they carefully sort of renovated it, got it back to as new a condition as they could. And they've got it with a mannequin inside that has fresh air blowing through to keep the sort of degrading chemicals from building up inside. So I think it's really worth preserving. Interesting also that Mike Collins, who was the pilot orbiting the moon 30 times while Neil and Buzz walked to the surface, he went on to become the head of the Smithsonian, in fact, of the Air and Space Museum there in Washington. So there's an interesting link between Apollo 11, the suit that they're unveiling today for everybody to look at, and that one of the crew, in fact, helped create that whole exhibit so that people could see and learn and understand from things that had happened.
I don't know if we can show that viz again, but it is really neat how you mention about the suit, how it's kind of dirtiest on the feet, and they've preserved that. Gets cleaner as you go to the top. So there's a shot of the suit. It's at the Smithsonian in Washington, and the people you'll see there, you'll see Vice President Mike Pence, also Neil Armstrong's son, and that's coming up in some of the pictures coming up. When you look at a suit like that, Nicole, what do you think about how things have progressed even since then?
Well, you know, I wish we had continued to be to have a presence on the moon, but obviously there are certain issues that have come up over time and changing governments, etc. But for me, it still means hope. I still believe that I'm going to see a man or woman, and they say hopefully the next boots on the moon will be a woman, a woman's, but it's just amazing to me. I would want to look at that suit and like go over it with a fine-tooth comb. I mean, this is part of the moon and part of our history. But you know, it's been 47 years since the last time we set foot on the moon. But you know what? We have better technology right now and things to make it cheaper. So hopefully we'll see this happen. But definitely in my lifetime, I'm hoping.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of leads to Eric's question. He is on YouTube, and we were talking about this a bit earlier, and then you're just mentioning there, too, that do you see commercial space tourism becoming affordable for everyone in the near future? And I'm going to start with you, Commander Hadfield.
It's important to remember that the lunar lander was built commercially by a company called Grumman. Even the first stage of the Saturn V rocket that launched 50 years ago this morning, it was built by Boeing, you know, and the second stage was built by North American, and the third stage was built by Douglas, which became McDonnell Douglas. So it was all commercial. It was just two specifications set by NASA. And that's a good way to proceed. It's becoming more and more independent of NASA as the technology gets safer and simpler. And just like sort of aviation was, it took decades of research, and then suddenly the airplanes were good and safe enough that we could really have transatlantic commercial travel. But that took 50 years after the Wright brothers to really make it profitable. And that's sort of where we are in spaceflight. We're trying to take all of that great history, improve the designs, take advantage of technology and miniaturization and GPS and computational fluid dynamics, and put all that together and make access to the rest of the universe as safe and simple and therefore as cheap as possible. Whether we'll get the cost down shortly here enough that it becomes affordable for everybody, that's going to take a while. But it's already come down, you know, many factors of 10. And I think Richard Branson is trying to let people get to space here very shortly for the price of an expensive luxury car. And a lot of people buy luxury cars.
Yes.
If you could go to space, even briefly, for the cost of a luxury car, that might appeal to a lot of people. It's that first toehold for pure tourism to start leaving the Earth. And I'm all for it. People should experience the rest of the universe. It shouldn't be something that no one understands except people like me. And so I'm all for it, but the technology is still pretty new, and it's going to be a little while yet.
Now, what we're going to do in the next 45 seconds or so is we're going to play exactly the time at 9:32 Eastern when the rocket took off. We're going to let people experience it like it's in 1969. So we're about 30 seconds away from that. We're going to do it at the exact time, just like you were watching Commander Hadfield when you were 9 years old. Let people feel it, feel that emotion, listen to
Everybody lean over and turn the volume up on whatever you're watching.
Get their bunny ears going. We're going to watch it together, and then we're going to come back and chat about it. Take a look.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control, and all still going well with the countdown at this time.
July 19, 1969. The giant Saturn V rocket stands steaming on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy, ready to hurtle 3 Americans into space. They're off to the moon for the first time out of this world to land on another. 3 astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, Michael Collins, confident about to board their spaceship Columbia that will take them on this historic journey into the unknown. Then the trip begins.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Oh, boy. Oh, boy, it looks good, Wally.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
We got a roll program.
Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour.
Columbia and Eagle were on their way. At stake, nearly 10 years of research, development, and fabrication. Some 20,000 companies throughout the United States participated in the building of the Saturn V rocket and Apollo spacecraft, which carried astronauts Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins on their historic journey to the moon.
And we in the studio here, like the people in Mission Control, will be no nearer to the event than you will at your TV sets. We'll all be 240,000 miles away, and we'll be all together, so let's make it a night to remember. Happy landings. Till then, good night.
Most certainly was a night to remember. I loved, you couldn't see behind the scenes here, watching Nicole, watching Commander Hadfield. I have goosebumps. The control room was telling me they had goosebumps. Did it feel like it was yesterday, Commander Hadfield?
Sure. My life is inextricably linked to all of those events. And people say, do I miss being in space? It feels like part of very much of what I'm doing right now. Being on this cottage island where I watched that launch and watched the lunar landing, it's just a really important and formative part of what we're doing today. The things that I've had a chance to do, the things that David Sejak just did, and what Jenny and Josh and Jeremy are getting ready to do. To me, it's all this cool part of time in history. This is what's happening. This is the very edge of human capability, and giving us a perspective on the world, allowing us to see our planet in a way we've never understood it before. So yeah, it's all very much fresh in my mind. It is our lives right now. So there's nothing in the past tense about it to me. This is the moment in time.
I have to come to you, Nicole. You were saying you almost had tears in your eyes.
Yeah, every time, honestly. There are a lot of events, and it's really kind of strange for me because I wasn't around, but at the same time, I loved when they said the spaceship. The spaceship, it's in the 40s and 50s, that was a thing. It was talking about science fiction and getting off the planet Earth, and here that was becoming a reality, and it's something incredible.
Commander Hadfield, when those 3 astronauts are sitting there, explain what it's like, for their bodies and what they were experiencing when they were heading to the moon.
It takes about 8.5 or 9 minutes to leave the Earth and get into orbit, depending on which spaceship you're in. The 3 that I flew took one about 8.5 and the other about 8:55. So it only takes the time maybe to drink a cup of tea. That's how long it takes to get to space. But the forces involved, you go from lying on your back, thinking of the million things that can go wrong, being as focused as a crew of human beings can possibly be, hyper aware. Nothing else in the universe matters except your part in getting this spaceship to where it's supposed to be. The permission to focus that carefully, and the intensity of it, but also the excitement of a little 9-year-old Canadian boy like wanting to run around the whole cockpit and just scream and yell and wave his hands. And I'm sure Mike and Neil and Buzz, they were all just in their 30s, you know. They were just guys in their late 30s, and this grand adventure, but it was counting on them to do all the right things. And all sorts of things can go wrong. You're focused on those. The vehicle takes over physically. The power of it, the vibration of it, the acceleration crushing you down in your chair, like more and more people are piling on top of you as you go hurtling up. You go through the speed of sound, you know, faster than Chuck Yeager in 45 seconds, going straight up, accelerating on this monstrous bullet that is taking you vertically away. By the time the first stage is done, you're already 70 kilometers up and 100 kilometers away after 2 minutes. You know, it's just wild, the power of it. And then another 6 minutes of this dragster just going faster and faster and faster and faster, crushing you heavier and heavier and heavier, until finally, after 8 minutes and whatever, 45 seconds or so, the engine shut off, everything's perfect, and you are instantaneously weightless. It is one amazing cup of tea, I tell you.
Amazing cup of tea. I'm sitting here and it's just like, wow, you explained that so well. It feels like I experienced it. Now, it's true. I love it. And Nicole, talk about the fact, we heard there from Commander Hadfield that it's in phases in 1969. It comes in phases. So there's 3? Am I right?
It's 3 stages.
There
are 3 stages to the rocket. I mean, we still see that today with, for example, the Falcon rockets. You have a first stage, a second stage, and there in the 1969 launch, there were 3 stages. The first, obviously, to escape Earth's gravity, the most powerful, force that you're going to feel. Then you had the second stage, and of course, they also had to insert themselves into an orbit. After orbiting Earth once, they had to insert themselves into another trajectory towards the moon, and that was another firing of another stage.
Let me bring in, oh, sorry.
Judge, let me say one thing. Yeah, there was a professor at Queen's University back before anybody ever thought of going to space who actually came up with that idea of stages. I think his name was Bill Leach, and he was just down in Kingston. But he had, late at night, he was fascinated by space travel back in the 1800s, and he independently came up with the idea that you can't put it all in one rocket. It becomes inefficient. You want to have a first stage to get you above the air, and then the second stage to get you to orbital speed, and then a third stage to take you to the moon. He figured all that stuff out back in the 1800s. Another Canadian, a dreamer trying to turn fantasy into reality. Even before, he was doing that by candlelight, figuring all those things out.
Wow.
That is so amazing to learn that. And I hope that, young people who are watching as well look at these types of things and think, look what I can do. Now, I want to bring in something else. Michael Collins, who, of course, he was the command module pilot. He is actually where Apollo 11 launched in 1969 on this day. And he explains for himself what it was like when it took off. Take a listen.
On board a Saturn V after engine ignition is quite different than what you might imagine. If you watch it from a distance, it makes a stately ascent, and you're quite aware of the gigantic power it is producing, 7.5 million pounds of thrust. But inside, it's a different situation. Inside, you're not worried about your power so much as you're worried about your steering. And you're suspended inside the cockpit, not too far away from that launch umbilical tower that's right off to one side. As you lift off, if there's any imbalance, it's compensated for by the swiveling of your motors below you. You have 5 engines down there. And as you ascend very slowly, majestically inside, it's a different situation. You feel jiggling left to right, and you're not quite sure whether those jiggles are as big or small as they should be, or how much closer they're going to put you to that launch umbilical tower, which you do not very much want to hit right that moment. So it's a totally different feeling at liftoff. the nervous novice driving a wide vehicle down a narrow alley, and then once you clear the tower and things smooth out a bit, you pick up speed, then it becomes more like you might imagine watching it from afar. You're more conscious of the gigantic amount of power below you. You're more conscious of the acceleration and the speed that you're picking up, and then you soon find out that your machine, your Saturn, breaks apart into pieces. When it's finished with piece number one, it jettisons it, and that gives you a momentary skyrocket inside the cockpit. The cockpit is immediately full of not any fire or flames, but the vision, the idea, the sight of being surrounded by fire. Then when it gets through that little hiccup, from then on it's a quieter, more rational, silent ride all the way to the moon.
What did it feel like when that second stage lit?
Commander Hadfield, again, I loved watching your reaction to that. Just tell me what you were thinking.
So Mike is so self-deprecating. He's a great guy. He fascinating interest, and he described himself as a nervous novice. He had been a fighter pilot with 3,000 hours. He had ejected from an F-86. He had already flown in space on Gemini 10, I guess, and he'd done 2 spacewalks. And just like I was during my first spacewalk, he'd been blinded by contamination in the suit during his first spacewalk. So immensely capable and accomplished guy. And, he describes staging as that little hiccup. But he talked about the rocket steering itself. And on the shuttle, you didn't really feel that because there was so much vibration. But on my third space flight on the Soyuz, you could actually feel the rocket steering itself, almost like a boat cutting through the waves where there's a little left, right. You can feel that the vehicle trying to follow the exact track. And also, just coincidentally, on my first 2 space launches on the space shuttle, I launched from the same launch pad that Mike was just talking about, pad 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. And it was so important to me on that morning, as I was waiting for my turn to get on my hands and knees and crawl into the space shuttle, that I was standing up there on the same place that those 3 guys had gotten ready to climb into their Saturn V, looking at dawn at the coast of Florida, looking back at the tens of thousands of people there ready to watch the launch, that palpable personal link with history. And Mike makes it sound so offhand, but it was a wild, wild ride, and it still is.
And we're showing the launch pad that you and as well the other astronauts launch from. And Nicole, you want to make a point about that launch pad too.
I think it's fantastic seeing that pad there because we have the next generation. We have SpaceX launching from that location, and it just heralds, a new type of space age, and we're going to see this happen very soon. I mean, the Falcon Heavy, we've already seen launch from there, and next will be Cruise, and it's another chapter in our space race.
So exciting. I want to get back to some more questions from our viewers because we have quite a few of them. Carol Lloyd on Facebook asks, how do you manage to get sleep in space when you're constantly in such a heightened state of awareness?
Carol, you have to, timing is everything. And there are moments where you have to be exquisitely awake, as aware and ready and hyper prepared as you can possibly be. And you've been regulating your own sleep and your diet and your patterns of concentration for months beforehand to be ready for this moment, maybe like an Olympic athlete or an F1 driver or something. But once you get past a threshold, once the big engines have stopped and you've checked that there's no leaks in the vehicle and everything's ready, then suddenly you are beautifully comfortable and weightless, and it's quiet, and the vehicle is healthy, and it's like, all right, the next big event is in an hour. I'm going to have a quick little nap here and get my batteries recharged. And so there's a lot of napping goes on in space. And then on the overall schedule, once you've got the big stuff done, you get into a regular 24-hour cycle. And on your complex schedule that Mission Control sends you, there is a 7 or 8 hour block that says sleep. And you get to a quiet place, you float into a sleeping bag, you zip it up, you tie it to the wall so you don't float around the room and bump into things and kick switches. And then you relax every muscle in your body. And it's sort of like an infant in their mother's womb. They come into that position with your arms up and your waist bends and your head tips forward a little. You don't need a pillow and you don't need a mattress. You don't have to roll over. You can relax every muscle in your body and drift off to sleep. And it's quite comforting. And the machinery that keeps you alive, the pumps and the fans, it's all around you thrumming. And I think it's sort of like being inside your mother's womb, or all of her biology that's keeping you alive. I'm sure it's quite noisy for an infant in the mother's womb. I had the same sort of feeling, maybe, that this is what it was like before my mother gave birth to me. Maybe that same comfort of being inside a cocoon that's keeping me alive, and a wonderful privilege to relax everything and float off to sleep.
Yeah, it must be so nice. Nicole.
So I'm wondering, it's a beautiful sound. I suffer from insomnia. This makes me want to go up into space, and maybe I'll figure it out. But I wanted to also talk about, the glamour of being an astronaut that we see here on Earth versus what you mentioned about work, and then you have a schedule. You just have a schedule with a beautiful office view? Is that basically what it is?
Oh, it's, of course, it's many decades of work in advance. I was an astronaut for 21 years. I was only in space for half a year, so 20 and a half years of work on Earth. But on orbit, this watch, which is the same watch sort of that the three guys wore to the moon, would wake me up at 6 a.m., take care of, toiletries and things in the morning, 2 toilets for 6 people, and grab a bit of breakfast. You brief with everybody. And then the days are about 16 hours of work. You have 2 hours of exercise. Your time is scheduled to every 5 minutes for the whole 6 months that you're in space. What you're doing now, what you're doing 5 minutes from now. They're trying not to waste any time. So it's a very regulated, choreographed existence, much like it was for Neil and Buzz on the surface of the moon. That wasn't freestyle. Every little move had been planned. And so it's like that for 6 months. But there is time in there that says sleep. And all astronauts steal a little bit of that sleep time to spend time looking out the window, to play with weightlessness, to write, to take photographs, to play music, to whatever it is that you like to do when you have a little free time, to not just have a technical robotic existence, but to really sample the human existence.
We remember you playing guitar.
Of course.
It was great.
Yeah.
Here's a question. This one's really interesting for both of you, and it's come up quite a few times in the list. So it's from Chris Curry, but many people have this question. Commander, are aliens real? And what is your opinion of Area 51?
We've never found life anywhere but Earth.
Right.
Black and white, dead simple. We have never found life anywhere but Earth. That doesn't mean there isn't life anywhere else. We just haven't found it. It seems unlikely. Actually, something we've recently discovered through our best telescopes is essentially that every star has at least one planet. Because we've seen thousands and thousands of planets now with our very best telescopes around other stars. So to learn that every star has planets, we can count stars and we can count galaxies. So then you can start to do the math. How many planets are there? And the number is so huge, it's essentially infinite. It's like a septillion planets. So to think that we're the only life in a septillion of possibilities seems unlikely. But then again, we haven't found life anywhere else yet. Maybe we will find life on Mars, at least basic primitive life like Earth used to have, or maybe on Enceladus, or maybe on Europa or Titan or somewhere. We're looking, and we're sending probes and digging deeper to all those places, Canada included. But as for right now, no one has ever seen life from anywhere. There's all sorts of science fiction stuff, and it's great to imagine, and there's all the excitable entertainment that's on TV about it, and people saying things out of context. That's all fine. I'm all for finding life somewhere else. Area 51, I mean, that's this wonderful big science fiction meme of a legend, but it's a lot of marketing and silliness. We're not that good at keeping secrets. And if we had a technology from somewhere else, then why were my spaceships so primitive? And it doesn't even pass the common sense smell test. It's fun to imagine, you know,
Sure is.
Like the Twilight Zone in the 50s and 60s. But unfortunately, it's just one of the thousands of areas that the government has to do research and, you know, science and to work on some of the projects that are coming up. So yeah, people need to be patient, scientific, and informed. I think we have a very good chance of finding life in our solar system within the next few years because of the technology we're looking with. But so far, we haven't found anything.
Nicole, I want to get your thoughts on that too.
I agree wholeheartedly. I really do think we are going to find life in our solar system, and somewhat soon. I think that we have the Europa Clipper that's hopefully going to be going by Europa, moon of Saturn's Jupiter's. That's Enceladus. That's Saturn's moon, and as well. It's always important to remember that we're looking for life as we know it. We've discovered extremophiles, microorganisms that are living in extreme environments that before we had no idea that was possible. Areas with no light or very little oxygen or no oxygen. But we always thought that those were ingredients necessary for life. So who knows? We might on Titan, Saturn's moon, find life that is able to live in a methane atmosphere.
Now, this hour has just zipped right by, and I want to get final thoughts from both of you as we head into this week. And then on Saturday is, in fact, the actual day when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. So just your final thoughts, Commander Hadfield.
I think it's really important for young Canadians to see the opportunities that are out there. What do we do that is in the middle of the envelope, but what things are we just becoming capable of doing now? What things are going to be available to my children and my grandchildren that weren't available to me, and how they can take an active part in it. The choices you make as a young person turn you into the adult that you're going to be. They build the opportunities for who you're going to be in life and the things that you're going to be able to see and do. And you look at someone like Jenny Saidi, who's one of Canada's astronauts. She might be the first Canadian on the moon. She's been working on it since she was a little girl, inspired by Roberta Bondar and going to the science museums in Calgary. She became a mechanical engineer. She studied, she worked on it. She's a rugby player. She's a rock star of a human being, and she's one of Canada's astronauts. But none of that happened by accident. She was inspired by other people. She saw some of the things in the future, and she changed who she was. And to me, that's what everybody should take from the Apollo program. It gives us opportunity to imagine and ourselves being someone different.
I think that is a wonderful thought to end today on. I want to thank Commander Chris Hadfield. He is the first Canadian to command a spaceship, the first Canadian to walk in space. Thank you for taking all of those questions from our viewers and taking the time today. Nicole Mortellaro, the senior technology reporter. I appreciate both of your time. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.